All flights are now boarding. Welcome to Indie Game International.
Escort a blind girl 500 miles down a treacherous valley in the wake of an invading horde. Not sure what reward would be worth that.
Pirates.
Coming aboard!
The Shades were fortunate to gain hold over such a creature.
Alex, your weapon! It's on fire!
I know you can use the damn thing. Start swinging, girl.
In the dark, you shine, Alex.
Every one of us serves the Fae, whether we know it or not.
I will not serve them.
That is why you must die.
Adriana told me you were coming. A blind princess, doomed to watch her kingdom burn.
If you want the kingdom, you will have to take it from me yourself.
From one second born to another, it's not an easy thing, being in someone's shadow.
I like the shadows.
Oh, the clansmen again.
Mara, and they're coming this way.
Use your fire. It may scare them off. This is as good a time as any to put your new powers to use, Princess. Remember, you need to build favor with the Fae realm before you can bring the fire.
Here's a young woman who knows a thing or two about finer things. I know a merchant from the capital when I see one. I can give you an excellent price on the furs. Well, fine pelts this warm west of Riverton.
Actually, I'm looking to sell my cloak.
Times is hard for me, too. Not sure what I could afford.
100 copper?
Oh! I mistook you for a fellow merchant. I see now that you're a highway robber. Why don't you just take my entire cart while you're at it? I could also throw in what's left of my teeth, if you like.
It's right here in front of us.
I think I missed.
Here, hand me the shovel. I'll show you how it's done. Rats in the cellar, hear them squeak. 3 dirty rats to get your sweet. I've got one here. I keep perfectly still and swing in the direction of the rat. Gotcha. So, if you collected 3 rats, Cook would give you a sweet. The other rule was if you accidentally hit another child, you would have to give them one of your rats.
So your cook would send spoiled children into a dark cellar to catch rats and keep them out of the kitchen.
I didn't think of it that way. It was still one of my favorite games. I nearly always won. This way.
It's moving toward us.
The Shades were fortunate to gain hold over such a creature.
Shield ready, Alex. Hey, you!
You hear that? What did you say about my mother?
What was that? I see the...
Fresh bread, 2 loaves for a copper.
Here we are, the Wandering Goat. I'll assume it's an inn and not a stable. Shall we enter?
Press right trigger to enter. Left trigger to leave.
Ready your shield, Alex. They may throw the first axe as they charge.
Welcome to the podcast. We are here today with Dave Evans of Falling Squirrel. Dave, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm very glad to be talking about my game. So thank you for having me on.
Yes. So tell me about this game. The first question I usually ask is please give the elevator pitch for what is the Vale. I think you will have a very interesting answer to this question. So what is the Vale?
Well, it's a game that has no real visuals. It's played entirely in audio. It is set up to be a robust action adventure game with all the things you would expect in a visual action adventure game with some RPG elements. But we try to take everything you would expect to see in a visual game and find ways of making those things happen with all audio. It's a fantasy, set in a fantasy world with a lot of noisy medieval combat, which is very helpful for making an audio game. And it moves between sort of an intimate close quarter combat system to open exploration of certain areas in which you sort of try to find secrets and uncover clues and pick up quests like you might expect.
Yes, I have played the game. I played it on PC. Is that the only place it's available?
Oh, Xbox as well. Xbox One or Xbox, whatever.
Right.
One or SX, whatever.
Yeah. So
yeah,
I played it on PC, and I have to say, like, words don't do justice to like how I can explain why this game is so immersive and so interesting. I've been a gamer for 20 years, and I don't think I have ever seen anything like this. So I think my first question should be, was there, for you, is there a blueprint for this? Is there a something that you looked at and said, because to me it's completely new, but for you as the creator, not necessarily kind of like a lame question, like what was your inspiration, but is there a blueprint for this kind of thing?
Initially, no. I was not aware that there were other games even remotely like this. There are a select group of audio games, actually quite a few made by hobbyists. Some have made some approaching commercial games. Most of them are made for the blind and low vision community, or many of them are made by programmers or developers who are blind. So that is the entire genre right there. And there are some examples of mechanically, some of the things I'm doing are in a weird way invented in my mind as if this might be novel and new, and then finding very similar things in this very small genre. So there's a game called A Blind Legend, which had combat similar to mine in that you would hear enemies around you in 3D spatial audio or binaural audio, and you would swing out where you would hear them. And there was a shield and a sword. That's where there's some similarity, and which is great, by the way, when you find something that's done fairly well that you can look at and say, well, how would I add to that? So that was great to have that. But there was not an expansive story. There wasn't much choice in movement. It was a very linear story, and the narrative was not at all robust. There was no choice of weapons, that kind of stuff. So there's certainly a lot more I could do with that genre. And then there's a few narrative-based choose your own adventure style games, and some RPGs that are very much about following in audio, following sort of radar sort of sounds and stuff. So it's not very immersive because you're constantly listening to instructions or turn left, turn right, and robot voice, that sort of thing. So I could also see things that, at least for the blind community, they might be a little bit familiar with, but then trying to take those things they're familiar with and things that people in the sighted community are not at all familiar with, and then trying to set it up so that you're never really taken out of the experience for any specific accessibility reason, that everything is designed in the game world to be intuitively or to be intuitive in the way that you would go about, let's say, moving in a space. So there was a lot of new things we were doing to make something that had been done very immersive and pulling out a lot of the artificial sort of things that these games are sort of forced to do. Even I'd have to say Last of Us Part 2 has an incredible accessibility mode. The features that they have, it allows someone who's completely blind to play that AAA title from beginning to end, which is an exceptional achievement. But they do rely a lot on radar type cues because their game world isn't designed specifically for pure audio interaction. And that's maybe what we were doing. We're trying to take that a step further and saying, no, we're going to set the location of everything you care about in the world in a way that you can get to it simply by listening to that actual in-world sound.
Okay, this is all so fascinating to me. I have so many specific questions, but I think I want to ask you, have you tell me the whole story, like in chronological order, from when the moment you got this idea. And then if I have questions, I can interject with maybe my specific questions along the journey. So maybe start with, was this game conceived? It was conceived by you, correct?
Yes. Yep.
So was it conceived? I mean, I'll probably just have you tell the story, but was it conceived? Were you looking to do it for the visually impaired community?
No.
Okay.
I wasn't initially. I come from a film and television background. I worked in AAA for about 8 years, moved into indie game development as a game director. And I was looking for a project where I could do a lot more with narrative and working with performers, actors, voice performers in this case, and wanted something I could do on a relatively low budget. So I thought, why don't I try making a game, an audio game? Not even knowing that there was a genre. I just thought that would be an interesting thing to try. I thought of having a main character be blind, which turned out to be a bit of a trope, which I'll explain in a bit. And then not obviously, but within about a month of developing ideas for it, I said, well, I should probably reach out to maybe the CNIB, which is the Canadian National Institute for the Blind here. There's an office in Toronto, but it's a Canadian institution. And just, find out if there's people who'd be interested in knowing about this game and maybe making sure it's accessible. I just thought it would be a something that would kind of work out nicely because obviously an all audio game would have to be played without any visuals. So there was there was a huge interest. There was obviously a big community who had played games that are not necessarily accessible, but finding ways to play games with friends or games that just have a really specific links between the tells that are visual and the tells that are audio. Like fighting games is a classic example of a game that are generally accessible by chance for the blind community. And I used them as the first group of focus testers. And that started not only directing what I'd want to do in accessibility, because I'm like, oh, I got to make sure I get that right, because this is where I'm getting a lot of my feedback from. And it seems like a silly thing to dismiss. And then secondly, they were also familiar with all the games in this genre already. So they were the best group of testers to work with, because they would know what's been done. They would know what works, what doesn't. So I immediately took advantage of this amazing group of people who are very eager to help me. And then also help me, navigate some of the tropes I was going to run into. The first one being a sighted developer wants to make an all audio game and have the main character be blind. It's a novel idea from my perspective. I'm like, for me, it's a great way of aligning the mechanics of the game with the experience of the character in the game. And it was a transportive experience for me. I'm not blind, and now I'm going to be limited to senses I'm not used to using. And from somebody who's been blind since birth, that's not a terribly novel experience. And they see it a lot. So there's quite a few games in the genre, in particular ones that are developed by sighted developers that start there. So because there was so much narrative involved in this game, there was also a way out of that trope, which is I could also just make a story that that maybe challenges some of the things that you fall into when you tell a story about a character who's blind. The idea of the blind swordsman. I mean, literally, she's a blind swordsman. But the idea of having a character's superpowers or the thing that makes them a hero connected too directly to their blindness, like Daredevil's a great example of that, where he is a superhero because of his other heightened senses. And this is something that I was kind of instructed to tread lightly. And ultimately, the golden rule in this all was make sure that this character is defined by something more than their disability. And so my challenge then in staying the course with this blind character that I just really wanted to tell a story about was to pretty much make you forget that they're a blind character within the first half an hour to hour of gameplay. And then you more define them as a princess who's trying to become a leader, who's trying to gain a certain amount of self-esteem and then go through this crazy journey and learning about her family past and all this stuff. So I hope if I've done anything successfully, I hope I've done that, in that you do kind of forget about that relatively quickly.
So I find it very interesting that you just mentioned that the whole situation with a sighted developer creating a game wherein the main character is blind and it's audio only. Mm-hmm. And you kind of came to that realization. And I feel like I, as the player, sort of did too. You know, when I first started playing the game, I said, okay, so I'm interacting with the world right now without my vision, and it heightens my hearing, and it makes me able to determine where things are coming from, and it makes me able to complete the challenges in the game. That, to me, that's a new experience, but that's because I'm sighted. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like, as a player, you realize, I'm like, this is so new. Imagine interacting with the world without sight, but that's how millions of people live. So it's a fascinating realization. Did you ever consider not making her blind because of this trope?
No, I think maybe there's a philosophy I did have to think about this, but the answer is no. But there's this idea of having the mechanics of a game be as close to the narrative experience of a main character when you're making a story game. And I mean, there's other games that have done things like this without literally making the character blind. Like the world turns, all the light goes away in a world or something like that. Or they live in an underground world that you can't see and there's no light or electricity. There's been a few things like that done in the genre. But I thought this was still ultimately the simplest way of connecting that mechanic to the main character. And it's ultimately a character. I fell in love with the idea of this character. And at a certain point, I suppose there would be a possibility, where there was enough holding this character up without that her blindness being a main factor in her story, that it wouldn't have been impossible to pull that away and say, oh, this is just a princess who's not as favored by her family and gets sent out into the boonies and like that narrative thing. But it also made the setup that I ended up writing into a lot easier to maintain, because it could be established within a word, which is this king, her father, did not have the imagination to see how she could be anything but somebody sent out into the wilderness to lord over a small castle, so that she could not stay in the kingdom to help her brother be king, which is the initial setup of the game. So it's helped with her exile. It helps set up her character. There's too many things I thought were working with it. And I again, I haven't gotten a lot of, what I can think of after people play the game, I haven't gotten any negative feedback from the community on this, but I would certainly be open to people that would challenge my decision to go ahead and do this. It's not something that I don't think is a non-starter for a discussion point, because, I like, as a creative person, I like to be challenged by that and think about how would I do things differently. And by the way, I probably would not come back to this for that reason. Certainly if I was to make another audio-based game, thinking of the blind community in particular, I would be much more ready. I kind of want to make a game that would be more transportive for that community. In other words, they'd be playing a sighted character, or potentially through the RPG mechanics of character creation. I'd love to make a game that allowed you to choose maybe a character that was blind or not in a scenario. And again, allow it to be an element of representation. At the same time, it allows people from any community to play an experience that's not theirs, that goes beyond just, I want to play. I mean, we already readily play outside of our gender. We readily play outside of our race. And I think everything should be up for grabs for the experience that you want to be part of, I think.
So this avenue of thinking that it appears you're thinking through right now, how many people in the gaming community, like what's the percentage of developers who are doing things like accessibility games for people who aren't like the sighted and the fully able-bodied?
Yeah, it's becoming an important thing, and I think genuinely important for some of the bigger companies to address this. I don't know how much you know about Last of Us Part 2, but it's a monumental achievement. I really can't say it enough how far they went to take a game that was not expressly designed to be accessible, like mine to some extent. It's, again, a convenience of there being no audio. And by the way, my game isn't accessible for people who are deaf. It is more the genre of an all audio game than it is a game that is meant to be held up as accessible globally. So that's important to acknowledge.
Right.
But it happens to provide content for probably the most underserved group that there is in terms of video games. Visual components are such a big thing that are there, that it's it's a much bigger challenge to find content that's completely accessible for somebody who's blind. And this is what Last of Us Part 2 did. And it's interesting because the next generation of games, the games that came right after, there was a tremendous amount of work that went into making things more accessible. But from what I know, we're up for a Game Awards nominate. We're nominated for a Games Award, which was innovation and accessibility. And I just in talking to other people that helped me develop this game, none of the games are except for ours is completely accessible for somebody who's completely blind, even though they've made it. I'll use Far Cry 6 as an example. That's a game that's made it much easier for someone who has very limited vision to play the game. So it's a huge stride for a lot of people, but it still isn't completely accessible for somebody who's completely blind. So that's, I think, where the future is. It really is in taking the experiences that the most people are experiencing and allowing, what's the word? There's like a buzzword in the industry about, it's not accessibility, but it's giving people the opportunity to be, it's inclusion. That's what I'm looking for. The idea that people are you feel more included in video games when the biggest games in the world that the most people are playing are ones you can also play. Even though I love knowing that there are people that really enjoy my game and it's even more special because there's so few games out there that kind of hit the bar of immersion and the breadth of the story. So it is somewhat special, but in a strange way, I hope this is a small window of being special. I hope within 5 years that there'll be 10 big AAA games that are fully accessible in all sorts of space. So it's something the bigger players are thinking about. And then it's always an interesting angle just from a challenge or development standpoint for some indies. A lot of indies are doing really great work too. And I think that actually it's surprisingly to me anyway, there's indies that are trying to do a pretty broad accessibility take on their games, like making sure that there's a lot of different elements covered. And for me, it was very focused. Obviously, it was it wasn't physical disability and it wasn't hearing disability. It was very specifically, but that's an expense thing for me anyway, and a focus thing. There's only so many things that a small team's going to be able to learn during development. Whereas if you're a team of 300 or 400, there are going to already be people that have specialized in certain aspects of making visuals more accessible or making audio more accessible and that sort of thing.
So how big was your team? How many people worked on the game?
The numbers were, it was very small. It was I had I guess I'd say 10 people were involved in the game in a way that they had a major influence on different parts of the game. But I mean, some people who had quite a bit of influence worked on the game for a week. So myself, I was the only one who was really on from the beginning to the end, like working constantly, even though I was also doing other projects. Again, it was over about 5 years working on this with really just 1 year of intense work on it. And then I very smartly made sure I had a very senior developer, a programmer come on, Paul Caparici from Creative Bytes. And I kind of teamed up with him for the last year of development where it was just him and I kind of like finishing the game. But I have consultants all over the place in just general audio because I'm not an audio engineer. I had an audio person that helped me do all the recording and get all the great voice performances from a technical standpoint. He was with me from the beginning to the end, coming onto the project a week at a time here and there. And then he also helped me make some special effects that I couldn't find in packages. He did some of the music in the game. So yeah, there's probably 10 to 15 hands that touch this thing. But on and off throughout the period of time. That was a really long way of answering that question.
That's okay. No, I find it interesting. Okay. So there's so many, like, I don't know how anything works in this game. It's so unconventional for me. So from the beginning, were there any ideas, things in the game? Maybe there are many, but things that it was going to be one way to serve the visually impaired. Mm-hmm. You thought of one idea, but then you had to scrap it and go with another one. I mean, just off the top of my head, something like the necessary inclusion of the woman who tells you what in the menus, what you're highlighting.
Okay.
Anything like that.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I only had one rule for myself going into this was I wanted to, anytime I could, have things unfold in world. So I really did not want a narrator coming in too often. I've actually seen a few experiences that were not even accessible experiences where they're very narrator heavy, where someone will come in and talk about elements. I don't know if you've ever played, what's the game? Divinity Original Sins, big RPG. they have a convention where there's just a narrator that will contextualize things that they didn't want to take the time to animate. So you'll settle into a scene in a game that's really an isometric sort of game where the world looks beautiful, but people are just in like hold poses or whatever. But this guy will come in and say that the thief's eyes darted side to side, and he'll kind of set the stage. So my first thought in it being a first person experience is I'm like, okay, I don't want to use that. That's also something that's very familiar to people who watch movies who are visually impaired with descriptive video, where someone's coming in and explaining all the action in between stuff. So I wanted to, for the novelty within the blind community, I wanted to get rid of that. I want to make the world work in a way that you wouldn't need a narrator to explain what's happening. That sound would do all this, the environment setting for you. And that something, even navigating a menu for selecting your weapons, or a menu somewhere else was just more inviting and didn't feel like techie. So I didn't want any robot voice. So these were all things I came in with. And then working with the community, I actually kind of maybe overdid it. I had a plan I was doing all these things that I thought were going to be more accessible. And one thing I kind of misread was the fact that within the community, there's a large number of people, a vast majority of people in the community, they're already using technology that is not meant for them. So there's certain things that menus do that I thought would be confusing that they're already ready to accept. For example, when you open a menu, they expect the first thing that you're on is the first option. So if you click on a menu and then you immediately after you click on the menu that says options menu, there's an expectation to hear the first thing you're sitting on. Whereas for me, I thought that'd be confusing. So I ended up having like a dead spot where you would land and then you had to push down to hear the first menu. Eventually we decided that was actually not a bad feature. But it was not the expectation. So that was probably the biggest eye opener, was that they're in trying to make something more accessible without involving the community. So the thinking I did outside of the community, it was important. It should always be important to include that community, obviously, but there's a certain amount of work I had to do in isolation. And then I'd come back and they're like, oh, don't bother with that. Everything works that way, Dave. You can consider that a convention of stuff we're already familiar with, so you don't need to overdo it. So that was nice. I got to have less stuff in there. And then probably the other big thing, which I thought was interesting, was that there is an assumption that everything that has sound means something. And so I had to be very careful with building sound in the world that didn't have a mechanical connection. So I put a church bell in one of my scenes far in the distance. And I just wanted to create a medieval village. And everybody was trying to find the church. And I'm like, oh, okay. So that immediately has meaning to like these soundscapes. Indeed. And it was pretty subtle too. And then it also drove me to realize that what's fun about this game, or can be fun, is that there's beacons in the world that should not be hard to find, because I don't want to frustrate people, but I should be allowed to reward them for listening for details, because it did seem to be something people were able to do and wanted to do. So eventually I ended up, because it was a beacon, I ended up making a bigger deal about it, but I did end up leaving the bells in, but put it in a scene with a monastery and made it the way to find the monastery. Even though it wasn't this really distinct sound, it was like, oh, if you move towards the west, you'll eventually hit the monastery. And then there's other little things you'll find in the world, chickens you can walk over and they'll fly away and things like that. But I just started to realize that details are kind of maybe where this game is interesting. Yeah.
Well, I do find it interesting that you just mentioned that, because at one point I remember I entered one of the areas where you can go to like different shopkeepers, and I heard a cough, and I was like, oh, that must just be part of this soundscape where I am. But then like one mission later, I went up to a woman and she was like, oh, my husband's sick.
Right.
And as I approached her, the cough got louder. And in my mind, I was like, of course that was needed, you know? Like I thought it was just part of the world, but it's very much part of the story, and I found that very interesting. So I want to mention one thing that I found absolutely amazing in this game. Like, really, like, we talk about in video games, especially like puzzle games, the aha moment where you like realize how everything clicks, or maybe in a regular game, like you realize what the gameplay loop is, and if you like it, then you found an amazing game. So I remember, and I also talk a lot about, I love in video games where they don't use words on the screen to teach you things. You kind of just learn. And I was talking to my friend earlier today about this game, and I was like, basically the whole so I was in a part where I was sword fighting, right? And it's all audio cues. You like hear the person about to swing the sword, so if you hear it to the left, you swing your sword to the left. And I just remember like realizing that if I hit the guy and then I can still hear him like reacting to my hit, that he was still there, so I could swing again and land a hit. And the game didn't tell me that I could do that. You know what I mean? Right. Additionally, I absolutely loved, and it's kind of weird to say this because it's about murdering people, but I really loved how, like, I remember I killed someone to the right, and I could hear his, like, death gurgles, but then someone was swinging to the left. So it really did a good job, in my opinion, of like, putting you in the battle. It's like I was distracted by what I heard to the right, but I was also elated by it because it means that I succeeded in what I was trying to do to the right, while also having to react to what was to the left. It's just a crazy experience, dude. Like, I mean, I realize that I'm kind of just saying praise to you right now about it, but was that your intention? Like, was that moment intentional without telling the player that you should be aware of these obviously different things around you happening simultaneously?
Yeah, I think what you just described is probably something that came fairly natural. It wasn't terribly constructed. There were things that I take pride in constructing that may have similar moments of like, oh wow, that really worked, or that was interesting. But it's I mean, I have to you know, being honest as a developer, it was also the discovery we made early on is that I did not think of the experience as being what's the word? In any way better than a visual experience. I didn't have an imagination for how could limiting visuals make this game more interesting in some specific way. And I think what happens for me, there's two things. One is, and it's both has to do with immersion and intimacy, is this idea that in doing all the things you normally do in a game, but doing it in binaural audio, there is something special about that effect. I mean, even the first time I heard a binaural recording, there's a bunch of them online, but the one I was listening to was a virtual haircut. I don't know if you've heard that one. It's fun to go check out, but it's just somebody walking around a binaural mic. And it's just the presence of the sound is so perfectly placed in 3D space that it was novel immediately. And then once I realized that there was novelty to that, all the things we were able to do in this game had a certain element of novelty. In other words, there's details you would never consider, that you would never feel that close to the death of a character or the breathing of someone else is attacking. There's just something that's separate. The visuals tend to pull you away from. You want to see, first of all, you want to see the spectacle. There's usually a different desire in a game that is visual based. I don't know if I want to be that close. For one, with the technology we have right now, things break down close. If you're actually that close in first person to the character you're fighting with in our game, you're going to start to see, unless, and actually not even unless it's AAA. AAA hasn't even gotten to the point where I can completely suspend my disbelief that there's a real person I'm fighting next to me. But in this game, just taking away that distraction, that uncanny valley of certain models not being perfectly real, but too real sort of thing. The fact that facial animation doesn't line up perfectly in conversations, just removing that allows me to now, from a creator standpoint, I just need a great actor to pull this off, and high quality sound recording and a good sound package. And a lot of the technology is out of the box stuff I'm using. I'm just now trying to exploit the most out of it. So when it comes to what you described, I I think it was sort of obvious to me at the beginning, but it was definitely something I had to make sure I didn't lose sight of, especially when I started bringing in music and other sound effects. Actually, that was probably the hardest thing I had to do. Was I did find some combat felt a little dead without having battle music, but I had to be very careful that the combat music didn't step on the intimate feel of combat, hearing people's footsteps. I mean, there's some scenes where people are moving around you and you know that there's a puddle in the right side because they walk into water every time they move to the right and they move out of the puddle. I mean, stuff that you don't necessarily notice, but subconsciously it feels very grounded and real and intimate because of the way it's set up that way, and it feels organic. So I kind of came by it naturally with the setup, but at the same time, I had to now make sure this little precious thing I found kind of by accident and with not a huge amount of work on my end, I didn't destroy it with the other things I knew I had to add to this game, like music.
Okay, so like maybe briefly explain, because I'm not necessarily technically minded when it comes to making video games.
Sure.
This might be a really too broad of a question, but like, what is actually happening while you're playing the game? Like, how much of it is scripted, especially battles? Like, are the battles scripted, or like, how does that work?
Yeah, no. That's a great question for especially for someone who's knows games and knows the options that are in front of us when it comes to combat. One thing that's really nice is that there is a definite organic feel we're able to get with combat simply by having a lot of audio material. So the numbers of different attacks and taunts and hit reacts and things, we had a pretty probably not any AAA company will probably have a similar pool that I have, but I definitely hit the bar where you should not hear repeated sounds. And they're varying lengths, and also the way that enemies respond. It's not canned, by the way. The way that enemies move around, there's a certain random movement in the timing and things like that when they move around the space. And there's also certain rules that dictate group combat, because combat in its stride it was actually the hardest thing to design for was interesting one-on-one battles, because it was too easy to track the movement of a character. So there's characters that could jump quickly to the side and attack, or characters that could swing from either side. And you'll notice there weren't a ton of single enemy combat scenarios. It was to really take advantage of the feeling of being surrounded and being intimately impacted by enemies, was the idea of fighting 2 or 3 enemies at a time. That's, I think, the game in stride. And the most sophisticated thing we probably did is the rule system that had to do with when an enemy attacks. We wanted to be relatively fair about attacks, that they would never come exactly the same time. We also wanted there to be a slight organic difference between certain enemies, how long they wind up and how, that sort of thing. So you couldn't totally queue up on everything perfectly. And so we had to have a rule system that allowed most of the time 2 attacks not to happen at the same time. But on the harder setting, some would come almost instantaneously, but you could potentially move your shield through the attack to block both. Little things like that. And essentially, because there was also an RPG aspect to the game where you're encouraging players to get better armor and equipment, we wanted to make sure that had value, in that the more organic and dirtier the combat is, even the best player is going to get destroyed in certain moments of the game. So you can never play it perfectly. Therefore, someone who can play it perfectly, almost perfectly, still has to, you're still going to have to account for getting hit 2 or 3 times or 1 or 2 times in a battle. Therefore, once you get up at the later stages of the game, you need better armor, or you're going to have a real hard time advancing. So, and that was as much an RPG choice as it was, in the end, made our combat feel fairly, I don't know how you felt about it, but it should feel fairly organic, that you can't totally tee off on specific things that are going to happen. The way enemies overlap their attacks is pretty dynamically changing.
Yeah, I think the combat struck a really good balance of, I've been explicitly taught how to do this, but then there are other things that happen that I wasn't taught about. but what I was taught gives me enough to adapt to these other like noises. And like I said, hearing this guy over here, but your attention should be over on the other direction. And like, that's distracting, but it should be because it's a battle, you know?
Yeah. And it reinforces this idea that one of the more important things in the game is listening for detail, not just timing or twitch. It's like knowing what the sound means. And maybe one of the harder things we did and is that there's not a great, I don't know, the verdict seems to be generally positive, but I did not create a very big difference for certain attacks. There's a longer, heavy attack that you're supposed to picture as your enemy raising his weapon up and swinging down on you. And there's another quick attack. And one, you have to have your shield up and ready to block. And the other attack, you should be able to interrupt. And then we introduce that the heavy attack can sometimes break your guard. Therefore, it is better to interrupt it. And I've gotten over time good enough to know what's coming, but I'm not certain in a single playthrough people ever get to the point where they feel they have command over that. But it is still honoring the thing I want, which is that people need to listen carefully for combat. And I guess if you don't care to do that, you just need to play in a lower difficulty setting where you can kind of mash a bit. But I think it does really require you to start really listening to what's happening and ignoring and trying to filter out some of the things that are not important.
So when you play the game, are you good at it or is it challenging for you? It is challenging for me in certain fights or challenging for me. So set to the highest difficulty level, there are some that I still find challenging. I think I could probably play the game from beginning to end without dying now after testing the heck out of it. And one of the things in any new version of this game, or very likely some sort of, I think I'm going to do an arena mode for ultimately the people that helped me make this game within the blind community. The game, from my perspective, is made to be played twice, once on normal and then once on hard for the challenge. And in that case, you really should be able to. I also made some interesting choices that you might be aware of, where I allowed you. I did some things that made it easier to come back to a shot, or come back to, let's say you've already heard a quest. If you come back to the tavern after completing a quest that you've done, but you heard about another one, you just get a short introduction to that quest where someone says, "Hey, are you going to go find that gold I told you about," or whatever, rather than hearing the whole big thing again. And so in my mind, I'm like, okay, in a first time playthrough, I'm also requiring a little bit of patience from the player. I don't have a mechanism for skipping stuff, but I'm on a first time playthrough. You shouldn't be hearing anything repeat, really. And then I realized that for a community that does not have a ton of content, they are quite readily, many people are readily playing this game up to 10, 15 times, the entire 6 to 10 hour, 8 hour experience. It was not something I was expecting. And of course, it very much changed some of the requests I'm getting, which is, for God's sake, Dave, can you let me skip the cinema? Can you let me start somewhere else in the game? None of this I did. And then I'm trying to think, well, why are people replaying it other than maybe lack of content? And it was to play their favorite fighting scenario. So this group that was really looking for this, because once you play it a couple times, you also realize that there's a little bit of choice, but not a huge amount of branching choice in the game either. So they're not playing it to get a different story outcome. Some of them are trying slightly different, like loadouts and stuff, to try different weapon setups and enjoying that a bit. But that to me, it's 2 or 3 times. It's because they love certain combat scenarios and they want to be able to jump to them. So to me, that's like, okay, well, that means I should have an arena mode because that is what people are replaying for, with a huge amount of option of like a holdout mode or some sort of like, or what's that mode where there's just an onslaught of people coming forever and ever. Horde mode.
Horde. Thank you. I blanked on that.
Wait, are you talking about multiplayer right now?
I am not yet.
Okay.
There is another whole factor though, where I would like, this is something I'd like to do this summer, which might be one of your questions at summer. What are you going to do next? Is to really evaluate what I have and what can I very easily do, probably in arena mode where you are fighting in some sort of arena scenario, like the street fights in the one city. There's a street fight, expanding it, having supernatural creatures be part of this sort of scenario where you can jump to the fighting scenario you want. You can have an escalated difficulty setting or whatever, and really try to support a group of people that want to get very good at fighting, and also make it harder too, because that was another thing. Is anyone who's playing it 10 times, they're like me now. They're like, oh yeah, I don't die anymore, Dave. Can you give me more of a challenge? And again, that it's not even starting the game on hard mode for the first playthrough. I think there's going to be a sufficient challenge for anybody, but you do that twice and it's diminishing returns. So there's definitely that. And then PvP is the other thought, is to finding a way where you could play against somebody in this scenario. I probably have to untether combat a little bit. There's little things I have in mind on how to do that. But this is definitely what interests the community more than anything else, is expanding on combat and making it really challenging. And again, this is a group of people who've been playing fighting games without any visuals for years. There's like, I got good at the game. There are people who are really, really good at the game. They don't get hit. Like, they don't take a single hit. That kind of good.
I'm amazed too at how much the game, like, there's this whole, like, people love these days challenging games, like I do too, but with challenging games, it's like certain things have to be in place in order for them to be repeatedly playable. Like when you die, it's better to restart as quickly as possible. Like death as a learning experience. And even like in this game, you'd think I would be frustrated, but when I died, I was never frustrated. I was like, let's do this. Like, I want to fight these guys and hear everything and just do it right. I remember there's one part in the very beginning where you're with your buddy and you hear people over by a river, and he's like, okay, we definitely should not go near them, so come this way. And at me as the player, I'm like, he's probably right, but I'm going to go over there and try to shoot them with my bow and arrow. And I died in that battle a couple of times, but I never wanted to follow my friend and not do it.
Right.
I always wanted to come back and do it. I'm wondering what changes with the difficult. I played it on normal. What does the difficulty change?
It's the biggest factor. Well, it's way less forgiving because it's pretty much I like hard because to me it starts to feel like, how would combat really go down? So if you get hit by a big heavy swing that crits you, at one point I was going to have a hard mode where that was an instant death. Like that was really, you're getting worn down in combat with a couple nicks and scrapes and you're getting tired. And basically both groups are trying to get that killing blow in, which to me is a little bit more like how, sword combat would probably go down. And the hardest level, I had to nerf it a bit because it was just too hard for too many people, even though there were there's groups that say, I like that sort of super hardcore mode. But I think you can take one crit. You might be able to take, you can take one crit. You can't take two. And, by the way, the one thing about combat, which is not super transparent, but is that crits mean everything. The amount of damage your items do on a regular basis don't hardly change at all. So if you get a heavier weapon or whatever, your basic damage of swinging cautiously and not giving it your all to really damage them is limited. And then the quality of the weapon really determines what the crit chance is. And then crits are 3 or 4 times more damaging than a regular hit. So it makes a huge difference when you crit somebody. The reason I did that is because during combat, you would feel like your weapon was better or you were getting better at something based on the hearing crit reacts from your enemies. So you could either feel like you're wearing them down where they're making like little sounds of discomfort when you hit them. And if you got a much better weapon, you would hear them screaming out in agony and dropping pretty quickly. And that was a lot better than like, well, how else do I have damage? Like I didn't want to have damage connected to the sound of like incremental increases in the loudness of the impact or incremental changes in the vocalization. So I said, I'll attach everything to crit. And it's just, you'll hear people screaming out in pain a lot more, and you'll immediately get the sense that your weapon has more value. So that was the reason I'd done that. So then the under the hood aspect of difficulty level is that it's maybe one crit and then a couple other little hits, or 2 crits and you're dead. So there's a very small threshold for mistakes. And then the big one is the wait time between attacks for enemies. So any group of enemies that surround you, I pretty much turn that off. So there is a possibility of 2 enemies attacking at nearly the same time, which would now require very advanced movements of your shield to block both of those. And it does require a much more cautious approach. And maybe that's my biggest thing I'd like to kind of fix is it does disadvantage people who want to play more aggressively with like more heavy swings on that's only an option for the big single enemy scenarios, like a bear or something, which you need to be able to crit them with the heavy swing in those scenarios. I don't know if you knew that, by the way, but the nether bears and the big bear enemies, you have to wear them down little tiny bit by bit. The only way you can ever crit them is by doing the big heavy overhead swing to sort of pierce their hide sort of scenario.
Right.
So yeah, that's when the heavy attack becomes more valuable. So if you invested in a hammer and you're always heavy attacking, and you play on hard, you have to be cautious in certain, as soon as there's more than 2 characters, if you get surrounded by 3, you pretty much have to switch your tactics and block and counterattack, or you're going to get destroyed. So that's the big difference.
Right. And I will follow your advice since I did it on normal. I am very curious to see what the hard difficulty will be like. This is a super random question, but I'm very curious. There's pretty much only one visual for the whole game, and that's like a dark red silhouetted woman with a shield.
Oh, in the cover, or the cover art.
It's like cover art, yeah. How do you choose that?
Yeah, that was one of those choices that the purist in me wanted to not do that. In fact, there was part of me that said, I want a completely black screen from start to end. That was a thought at the beginning. It was also, it'll save me some money too. Like, cause again, I was at the beginning, this was not a funded project. Right. And by the way, I did get funding from the Ontario government, and then eventually Xbox helped me bring it to their platform. So eventually that became less of a problem. But anyway, it was just this purist idea that, be black, perfect, nothing, it'd just be all sound. So there was issues with even like, technical requirements of video games to have some visuals up so people didn't know the game crashed and things like that. So there were aspects where I'm like, I need some visuals somewhere. And then there was another, and first of all, the many people within all sorts of communities, my people within the video game development community, and then within the blind community are like, oh my God, like don't torture people who are sighted. Just, give them some text and stuff for menus. Why not? And so I'm like, oh yeah, I'll do that. And then the image, the idea of having an image is how in the world do I market a game without any visuals? And I felt like I needed an image that's established something about the world, or at least the character you're playing. So the image I chose was relatively carefully crafted with the help of a concept artist, where I wanted to leave her. Originally, you were supposed to be able to choose between a male or a female main character. I was initially, my concern was that because the voice is in your head and is coming from your body, I thought it would be more helpful to have you be able to choose at least a voice based on gender that you more closely identified with. That was my first thought. And I very quickly realized that, well, as soon as it's not exactly my voice, male or female, I already have that little bit of disconnect. And I eventually, the actress was so great, I said, okay, well, I don't need the expense of finding a male actor, which was part of the reason, and a huge amount of work in getting this set up properly, and literally doubling the work. And I also really wanted to invest in the development of this character through that performance. Because initially the character is supposed to be a little more empty shell, that you could sort of, she wouldn't say as much, but I realized too much of the story ran through her. I just couldn't do it. So I said, you know what? Nobody seems to have a problem playing this character with this person's voice. it's not a non-issue. So I already had committed to it being a female main character. And then it was a matter of them thinking, well, I'll have a certain racial ambiguity in the silhouette, like trying to do all these things. I mean, she has kind of curly, wavy hair, and it's kind of dark, and the way we're shading it. Because I got into all these things where I wanted to create some impression of this character, and we didn't want to totally silhouette it. There's all these little things that went on this discussion, with the idea that I thought I was taking away that one kind of special thing you get like in literature, right? Which is you're now allowing the player to imagine into who they are. Or to the characters around you. So I definitely didn't want to fill in a lot of the world. But I did make a decision on that. I guess it could have been a perfect female silhouette in armor. And that would have been a little more pure in that you couldn't define much about this person at all, other than she might have had the trappings of being a princess, and that I think she has a torn dress. I don't know if you see, the image has like ripped dress components layered under all this armor she's wearing and stuff like that. So this is her like at the end of her journey, I guess, all like, suited up. But it was kind of purely a marketing choice. And then of course it was the one image I had. So now I put it into everything I was going to do. So that was that reason. The other image, the other visual is the particles that are in most of the levels.
Right.
And honestly, that was early focus testing, was that sighted players had a bit of a harder time. They're not in general, they don't listen very carefully to instructions. So when I was testing within the blind community, people would just very carefully listen to what they're supposed to do and then just do it. And the pickup for the community was very smooth in general. And then when I was at trade shows and stuff on loud floors and things like that, a lot of people weren't listening carefully to the instructions of how movement worked. So to be honest, I look at the particles, even though they're there from the beginning of the game to the end of the game, they are there as a crutch for sighted players to just know how movement works, to go, oh, I'm strafing. Okay. Oh, I'm turning on the spot. Oh, it's like first person controls, but you can't go up and down. And then you probably should just close your eyes and play the game. But that's why those were there, for that, only that reason, really.
Yeah, I will say it is nice to have something there, but I think I found myself during the combat moments definitely closed my eyes. But the non-combat moments where you're kind of just exploring, I was not compelled to close my eyes. But I just find it so interesting how many things in this game are not, like, I'm not told to do them and I just do them. And it kind of seems like it's the way it's supposed to be done. And I just find that very fascinating. How much work, I know that we have a short amount of time left. I want to respect your time. But I'm really curious just about sound design. So, what percentage of work was additional for you beyond the amount of sound design you have to do for a regular old indie video game?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I don't know I've been asked this before, because I guess part of it is what are we aspiring to do here? I don't have I don't even have the size of it. I don't even have the audio department of a AAA studio, just like what they would have at their disposal, or the expertise for that matter. These are people that are hand selected after working years in the industry to get these top jobs within these companies. But I'm kind of aspiring to have the game sound initially like the idea, oh, it's going to sound like AAA quality, but in this very weird way, because of going with binaural audio and just very carefully purchasing packages like medieval sound packages and stuff to get the decent bones for the sounds, and doing a lot of testing and balancing of these sounds for, again, a relatively long, protracted time of development, which is crucial for someone who's not a sound designer. Like, I'm not a sound designer myself. I had a sound designer, a TV and film sound designer, help me find assets or created assets for me to then figure out how the heck to implement in the game. I still had to do all that. And then I did get consultants at new engine stuff to sort of help me through this. So it's hard for me to separate what would be normal for someone who knew what they were doing, because I had to learn so much. So there's a bit of, it may have been, maybe I would have done half the work I ended up doing on this game if I had had 10 years experience in sound design. So that I have to say. So it's hard for me to qualify that. And then the second aspect of that is there's use scenarios for big budget projects that I did not have. I was not going to make a 7.1 surround mix. I wasn't mixing the audio channels to center channels, dialogue channels, because I kept everything in binaural audio aside from the sound in your head. So in a weird way, the work that I did in sound design was really just what I would have been doing in level design on a game with visuals. I figured out all the rules I needed for how sound dropped off for navigation. And I made sure my characters were the height of a regular person. And I made sure all the sounds were placed at the heights of where these sounds would, like, I just got everything all figured out. And then I just I would just make a world where I'd lay these things out in 3D as if I was taking visual assets and putting them in place. So again, it's hard for me to know how much more work that is, because I'm just, in lieu of visuals, I have these little boxes that contain sounds and I'm placing them. So a lot of that got eaten up by just regular level design. And then it kind of worked out with some careful balancing.
Is there an actual world? Like, is there an actual 3D world that you're moving around in?
Yeah. So I will actually, one thing, if you ever do want to show it visually to your audience, is I will send you some clips of some things that you in engine. But yeah, your character is a box with a stick and a flat shieldy thing. And those things are all moving independently with your stick movement when you're blocking and attacking. And there's real projectiles being fired when things are going past your head, when you're getting shot at. You're firing projectiles at other characters and enemies. And the only way I could really do this, because I'm not a sound designer, is I just got the general rules right. And then I just created a world that I thought would be easy to navigate or fun to navigate. So yeah, caves, villages, there's physical objects all placed with collisions and things that you are moving around through. So
when you swing your sword and you hit someone and they make the noise, that's an actual hit detection happening?
It is.
A physical?
Yeah, that's, yeah.
Dude, this is so, I'm so glad that I do this, that I'm able to talk to independent video game developers, because this is so fascinating. I'm blown away right now. That is so cool, because that was a question I had. But in my mind, I was like, no, I'm sure that you're not in a physical space, but you are, and that's amazing. And I want to also commend you, because you had mentioned you wanted to go like super pure and like have, no visuals whatsoever, but you do commit. I found myself while playing this game thinking like, oh, maybe there will be some kind of visual in the fireflies, some kind of visual representation of like walking up to something, like scenes where it's raining. I thought maybe you would see like the outline, the way they did in that.
Oh, right. Yeah.
The way they did in Daredevil, that 2003 movie. But nah, dude, you totally commit. But then I would catch myself. I would say, no, like there's not going to be anything visual. That's the point. So you did. I want to commend you for that. I found that to be really awesome. I'm just totally blown away. I'm sorry to just fawn over the game than an interview. So, infinitely fascinating. I am so glad that you made this game. I'm so glad that I found it. I'm so glad that Shane called you out. So I end all my interviews with 4 questions that I ask everyone. So we'll do that. It's kind of like a lightning round, and then we'll wrap up. But real quick, you mentioned that you spent 8 years in AAA development.
Yes.
Was that by any chance at Silicon Knights?
It was by chance at Silicon Knights. Yes.
What was that like?
It was all right. I know it's always like a loaded question, but I remember my first week of work there. Dennis Styak, the owner of Silicon Knights, said, he goes, well, one thing I can promise you is you'll never be bored. And I'm like, and yep, after 8 years, I was not bored. I'll tell you that much. And that's not that loaded an answer either. I actually enjoyed my time there quite a bit, with all the craziness that happened. And also just, you work with great people, on teams. I was the cinema director, and I learned so much about animation. I was not an animator, but I was directing animators. And that was like that's also not terribly traditional within AAA. I came from a film background, but I also worked a lot with motion capture actors and voiceover actors, which I was very comfortable with. Yeah, it was great. It was just such a great experience working with professionals. And even on this project, we'd won an award through Ubisoft, which came with some cash, which was nice. But it was like an independent. It's called oh gosh, I can't remember what it was. Indie Series awards, but it also came with consultation with Ubisoft. And because I came out of AAA, my first reaction was like, I don't need that. And it was so great. Like, just working with people who are truly specialists in what they do and have so much more experience than you do. Even like, because I feel very comfortable in my writing. Just it was the writer, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but I think he was the main writer on Far Cry 6, read the script and gave me some great notes. And I'm like, yeah, no, people are smart. And the more talented people you can work with. And that's really what I kind of rely on for a game like this, knowing how to do some things, but having to really rely on even a week of someone's time or a day of someone's time to just give me their expertise. I called in a lot of favors on that end. But yeah, and all set up because of my days in AAA. I was able to kind of tap into that.
That's fascinating. That could be a whole other interview, but I do want to address it actually in my first lightning round question. So my first question that I ask everyone who I get on the show is, what is release day like for an indie video game developer? But additionally, I would love to know what release day is like for a AAA developer, because I don't think I've ever spoken to one. So maybe what is that for indie and for AAA? What are the differences? What is it like for you?
Yeah, similar anxiety in that the work I was doing in AAA was relatively creative. So I can't help it. I care what reviewers think. And I remember like I worked on Too Human, and I remember like they weren't amazing reviews. There's a couple decent ones or whatever. But I just remember looking through and saying, oh, no one's really destroying the cinemas. I remember reading this stuff, but there's a pride element of it. And it's probably something childish I should get over. But it did matter to me. So that was similar to what I went through with this one, because as soon as there's not a big difference if you have a lot of creative work invested in it, because you want people to love it. You want people to love you. Like there's that aspect, very similar. And then there have been launches of games that I did work that I was proud of in terms of, oh my God, we got this done. We knew the stress were under, but we in AAA, we were already moving on to the next project. And there was other people to worry about how it was doing and marketing. So that was the big difference, is that I really could let that go in AAA. In every project I've worked on, the last few projects I've worked on in indie, I had to carry that longer. And this one in particular, because it was the first game, it was really only me. It was my company, and I'm the only one really continuing to promote it. I'm getting help from some people, but I'm the only one who's really, really paying attention to what's going on after launch. And that's the burden I just did not have in AAA. I can move on to the next game. And this one, it's like I am moving on to the next game, but I'm dragging this thing with me like as we go forward. But the response has been positive enough that it's not a painful experience, but it's still work, right? And I can't turn my brain off to ignore what's happening with the Vale, especially now that we're got an award and I've got to send assets to LA to put in part of a what do you call it? A promo piece or something. Like I've got work to do now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, your reviews on Steam are extremely positive, and the quality of the reviews too. They're like really well written, and they're very heartfelt. And I'm sure.
Yeah.
Have you noticed like a more than good response? Not like a heartfelt response in terms of positivity towards this game.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there is, in particular, certain responses I get from the blind and low vision community. There's a lot more personal stories that people are telling me, things that are much more heartwarming than I would normally get from a game, and an audience that came with me. I mean, making a game in a small budget like this, you don't usually have 300 people that reach out to help you test and play it. Or test the game and help develop it from the beginning, who literally 300 people play the game. I got 300 people responding to the game. And those people are also people talking about the game and the response of the game. And so it's a much bigger community than I'm used to. Even working in AAA, because obviously you're going to have a lot larger net of fans, but not dedicated in that way, and not with as much invested in the project. That's totally new to me, and a really gratifying thing. And I am always impressed with, aside from watching, like reading like comments on YouTube or something, which are kind of hit and miss, and usually a lot of miss. A lot of thoughtful responses. Even there's a couple of more critical reviews. They're still decent. I mean, we got like 7s or something on these reviews, but they were good reviews. Like, I loved what they said. I agreed. Like, yes, some people are going to feel this way. Some people are going to feel that the combat's repetitive. I'm prepared for that because of the nature of the game, and the how much how big our team was and things. Like, I know these things are out there. But I feel people were very thoughtful in the responses and really laid the groundwork for us to make another game or a better game, because it's not just immediate like walls going up for this was a bad idea. A lot of thoughtful thoughts on how to make it better.
Yeah, for whatever reason, I feel compelled. I was texting people while I was playing. I was like, all my friends who play video games. I was like, you guys gotta fuck it. Like, I know I told you about it, but now I'm actually playing it. It's crazy. So let's move on to the. Once again, I want to respect your time. If I have to say that one more time, it probably means it's not true. So, what is one piece of advice that you would give your fellow indie devs? One piece of advice.
I know this one. This comes from this experience and my recent experiences. Get your games out to people that aren't in your inner circle as soon as you possibly can. Get feedback early, especially if it's friendly feedback coming from other developers. They know that things aren't going to look amazing. They know where there are problems. Even if you know that there are problems with your game, get something that is playable out there and get people to play the heck out of it as early as humanly possible. And also develop for that. Try to develop so you have playable things as early as possible. That across the board, that's probably my biggest piece of advice, because it's very hard to work in a silo like that.
Right on. Thank you for that. If you could deliver one message directly to gamers as a developer, what would you say?
Other than the typical thing of like, games are hard, man. Like, seriously. Other than that, like for them, something that they need to know about development that I think gamers need to know about development, or something that, what kind of answers do you usually get with this one?
I usually get the first thing you said.
Yep.
Be nicer to us.
Right. Yeah. Is there something? Let me think. I'm trying to think of something based on this most recent experience, where I felt it was something people didn't get that I think they should know about development or games. Yeah. I mean, you know what? So much of it, any negativity was just super typical. It was, the idea of, or just people wanting to troll or make fun of a game. Like, I mean, actually, I thought some of them were funny, but the idea that someone was up in arms that I was charging for a game that looked like a 1990s screensaver. That's one of the things they said, because I have particles or whatever. I don't know if there's any response to that, because all of these are people trying to like make jokes and I don't know if they're truly trying to tear down this idea. I think people just like to be jackasses sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's hard for me to really think of someone who earnestly was misunderstanding what we were doing, or what gamers go, or what developers go through. I feel like there's so much awareness of how development works these days that I find that most people kind of know the game. They're kind of pretty sympathetic towards it.
Right on.
That's my feeling.
Yeah, it's not always negative. Yeah, like other answers have been along the lines of thank you. Like, what would you say to gamers? Well, I would say thank you for buying and liking my games. But
right, but that would have been a good answer.
Right. Well, I did, when that person said that, I was like, wow, touche, very nice. So I have to ask one more specific question. You mentioned that you were motivated by financial constraints.
Mm-hmm.
Without getting into specifics, maybe percentages, what how much cheaper is the development of an audio-only game?
Oh, now that I know exactly how to do it, it's like any endeavor. Once you've done it once, you can obviously do that cheaper again. It's a tenth, I would say. Depending on, and also look at what I was trying to do. I was trying to emulate a very expensive type of game, an action adventure RPG. Like, we're not talking about a point and click game or something like that.
It's a straight up RPG.
There are.
Really
so that's why it's that. There's all sorts of other scenarios where it's maybe half or a third or something, but no, this is straight up a tenth of the cost. Even if you look at an audio budget, without bringing in big names to do scoring or something like that. Right.
I also want to say that it's awesome that, like you said, you're trying to emulate like AAA. You didn't skimp out. A game like this you would assume would be short, but it's not. It's a 6 to 8 hour experience, and it's very robust. Like, I would say you succeeded on all fronts from my perspective. So, final question: could you please? I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. By the way, I'm infinitely fascinated with everything involved with this game. If you could possibly call out for me one indie developer that you respect and admire in this industry, and you think would make an excellent guest on this show, like you did for me today.
Yeah, I would talk to Phantom Compass. They're indie dev that have been around for quite a while. They've done a lot of service gigs as well as done their own, their own babies. Raised them as these games. They have a game they're developing, follow up to a role playing game. A pinball role playing game, pinball mashup with role playing. And I think they would be great to talk to because I think they have more experience in doing a lot of different things. There's almost nothing they haven't done in the industry in terms of console, 2D, 3D driving games, and really kind of moving around, trying to find their place, and also following where they need to keep the lights on and stuff. So they have like a pretty good story when it comes to survival as well. So I'd talk to them. That'd be an interesting conversation.
Right on. Where are they based? Do you know?
They're out of Toronto and locally in Niagara as well. They're a distributed group, as many small indies are now.
Right.
And in COVID, I think everyone's kind of distributed. But yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to seek them out. I'm going to play their games, and I'm going to try to get them on the show. One more time, thank you so much. Finally, lastly, just tell the people who are listening, how can they find Falling Squirrel, either social media, how can they get the Vale? Just give us the rundown.
Yeah, sure. Twitter is Falling Squirrel. And I think Facebook's the same, just Falling Squirrel. You can put that in. I'd go to fallingsquirrel.com. Our website kind of puts it all the different places. And our game's on Steam, and it's on Xbox. And it's called Vale, the Shadow of the Crown. Very cool. And I, as I've said multiple times in this interview, cannot say enough good things about this game. I absolutely loved it. And I guess that's it. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time, and keep making amazing games. Yeah, super enjoyable conversation, Jared. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. Well, that wraps up the episode. Thank you so much to Dave Evans for joining me to discuss this phenomenal game. I cannot wait to see what Falling Squirrel comes up with in the future. Okay, play the Vale on PC or on Xbox, and follow Falling Squirrel on Twitter at Falling Squirrel. You can also find them on the web at fallingsquirrel.com. All links, of course, will be in the show notes. You can find me on Twitter at IndieGameINTL, and you can email me if you'd like at sumadrepodcasts@gmail.com. If you want to sponsor this podcast, or you have a great idea for an amazing guest, email me or tweet at me. Okay, thanks one more time to Dave, and thanks one more time to you for listening. All right, have a great day.